Hi everyone, it's Sarah and welcome to Module 2. Today we're going to be talking about style. And essentially it's going to be a very quick overview of really the history of art, looking at how style changed. And what you'll notice is that every art historical period is really a reaction to the one that came before it. So it's constantly changing. Artists are constantly thinking about what came before them and how really to depict the world around them in a style that reflects their own time period. So at the end of this module, you'll be able to look at a work of art and really place it within the context of art history simply by looking at the style. And I'll give you certain keys to how to analyze actually any work of art that you approach. Last week we talked about medium. That's the kind of first thing you want to think about when looking at a work of art. And now we're going to look at the style and the content of it. So you can start to understand what it is that you like and start to determine what it is that your taste is. We're going to start with the Renaissance because that's really when figurative art takes off, I guess. And before this, in medieval art, figures are very static. They're not naturalistic. So this all changes in the middle of the 15th century. And this is a work by Giotto. I'm not really going to mention any artist names this week, but I am going to mention Giotto because he was incredibly influential in the history of art. He is the first artist to demonstrate emotion in art. And his work really signifies this transition from medieval art to Renaissance art. And it's in many ways, I hate to use the word revolutionary, but it's very, very significant. So let's look at this work and kind of pick apart what makes it transitional, what is medieval about it, and what is really new about it. So the first thing is the perspective. You have a very flattened image. The way that he creates perspective is by overlapping various figures. You don't really get a great sense of depth here, which is how, during the Middle Ages, the artists created compositions and images. It was by overlapping figures to give a sense of depth. However, here you'll see that he imbues this image with an incredible sense of emotion. Mary is holding Christ. She looks down. You can see the pain in her face. Certain people surrounding them, clasp their hands together by their face in grief. They spread their arms. The woman sitting by his feet cradles his feet, visibly distraught. The angels above the little putti, they are very dramatic, in fact, in the way that they express emotion. So all of this was very new. Nobody had ever seen this kind of emotion before. And so it's this transitional phase where you start to see something new in art. And that's really built upon in the 15th century. So as we get into Renaissance art, perspective develops a little bit. Here you have a one-point perspective where you have a perspective point way back at the end of the church, in the middle of the church, and all the lines move towards that. So what it does is opens up the composition a lot. So you get to see things that are a bit more expansive. You still have some figures that overlap one another, but you have a defined foreground, middle ground, and background. And in Renaissance art, during the Renaissance, also what happened was there was this renewed interest in classicism. So here you have figures dressed in classical attire. You have architecture that is based upon the Roman period. And all of that is brought to the forefront again during the Renaissance. You also have really beautiful portraits done of various women, of various men, in their clothing, in their classic attire. Here's a woman with a ferret. Anything that they were holding would have represented a part of their personality. So here you see the woman. I should say this is also much more naturalistically rendered than anything that would have been done during the Middle Ages. So in the Renaissance, you get this renewed naturalism, again, interest in classical subject matter, development with perspective. You also get to see mythological subject matter coming back into play. So here you see the three Graces dancing around. There's all this renewed interest in classical themes. And I should say, all of these works that we've seen so far have been in Italy. In the north, there is also, painting changes a lot as well, but it's slightly different. So let's take a look at a few examples from the north. Here's an example. This was an engagement portrait between this couple. As we talked about last week, we looked at an example from the north and how the use of oil really revolutionized and changed painting in Northern Europe, especially in the Netherlands. And here you get to see that again. So you have this man in very rich fur clothing. You have the little dog in front. You have the woman again in this beautiful green dress with all of the folds meticulously rendered. You have the chandelier, which is made out of brass. You have a convex mirror in the background. So all of this is the artist illustrating how talented he is and rendering different materials within a painting itself. And there was really a focus and appreciation for this kind of work. Again, you see a portrait here from a northern artist. It's really beautiful in how he's able to show how see-through the piece of cloth on her head is. So again, a interest in the texture of the items itself in Northern Renaissance painting. You can see her hair. She has it covered. Her silk belt, the little gold or brass buckle that she has, her rings on her finger. Doesn't have that sfumato effect that some of the Italian portrait that we looked at had. Sfumato means that it's sort of hazy, not as crisp and clear, but nonetheless there is this interest in doing portraits. So after the Renaissance period, you have the Baroque period. And the Baroque period originated in Rome. It really takes place from the very, very late years of the 16th century through the early 18th century. And it, like Renaissance and many of the other periods we'll look at today, it included painting, sculpture, architecture. And it was after this time of the Renaissance where there was this idealism, everything was very structured. Baroque art was really all about movement and an even greater sense of emotion. It's incredibly tied to the historical period because there were a lot of religious tensions during this time with the Counter-Reformation. And so the Catholic Church called upon its artists to really make large-scale works of art, like monumental wall paintings, huge frescoes, and then also other paintings that really reflected and was able to assert the power of the Catholic Church. So in this you get an incredible sense of movement. When you think of Baroque art, think about movement. This is a work by an Italian artist. I will mention his name. His name is Caravaggio. I mention it because he's very unique in the sense that he created this style called tenebrism. Excuse me, I'm thinking of the Italian term tenebrismo, but tenebrism, which is this very intense light and focusing on the figures with a very dark background. So this is Judith and Holofernes. And this is a very graphic image, but you can see that it's a very dynamic image. There is action taking place. Unlike some of the other images we looked at where you had men and women standing essentially in Renaissance art, whether it was the engaged couple or you had St. Peter receiving the key to Rome, where all of the figures were standing in a line. Here there's action. There's really movement and engagement between the various people in the image. Here's another example. Again, you still have classical figures. Classicism is still important during this time period. However, again, there's not that static energy between people. There's a movement. So the soldier lifts the women up in the air. Their clothes are flying in the wind. It's a completely different style and completely different way of depicting figures in art. Again, here you have these very robust female figures. Every figure in this painting is engaged with one another. They're touching one another. They're all connected in this way. Even the horse in the background, they're all moving together as one almost. Each movement affects another. And that's really what you want to think about when you're looking at Baroque art, is this incredible sense of movement and dynamism. Baroque art morphs into Rococo art. So Rococo is really the beginning of the 18th century. And where in the Baroque period you had very rich colors, you had very intense, almost overly so, depictions of movement. In the Rococo period, that settles down a little bit, but there's still this, there's still interactions between the figures, but mostly it's a light-hearted depiction of domestic life in upper-class homes. There are courting scenes. You see elegantly dressed aristocrats at play, usually in pastoral landscapes. It's all about courting and beauty and romance and fun and playfulness, and there's lots of sexual symbols, sexuality involved in the pictures as well. Think of Marie Antoinette, that she kind of embodies what the Rococo period was in art, if you think of her as a historical figure. So here you have a domestic scene. In Rococo art, the colors are usually very light, pastel almost. So you have an aristocratic family here sitting around the table eating breakfast, it looks like, looking at one another. And it's just a very intimate, sweet scene. This is a very famous image of the period where you have this woman very really kind of flirting with the gentleman below on the swing. Her shoe flies off, her skirt, opens up. It's very characteristic of the Rococo period. You see her in her light pink dress. She has almost two suitors, one who is behind her, swinging her, and the other who is below her. So it's very characteristic of Rococo art. Here's another image where you have a group of men and women really courting one another, and here they are out in a pastoral landscape. So a very idyllic, perfect, intimate landscape. After the Rococo period, at around 1750, there's a switch. And you enter a period of neoclassical art. And neoclassical art is really defined as a severe and unemotional form of art, which goes back again to the grandeur of ancient Greece and Rome. So the influence of Greece and Rome since the Renaissance, it never really goes away, but it has periods where it is more important than others. And really there is this renewed interest around 1750. because this is around the time when Pompeii is discovered, Herculaneum in Italy is also discovered. So there's this renewed interest in classicism. So the rigidity of the neoclassical style is really a reaction to the Rococo style and the very emotional Baroque style. And the rise of neoclassical art was in part of, as I said, just a general revival of interest in classical thought, which was also placing it in historical context, important in the American and French revolutions. So here again, you get to see this is a more severe composition. So you have a classical setting with these rounded arches, men and women in classical attire, but it's very static. So there's not the men, they're standing there, they're saluting this other gentleman in the red robe, and there's a severeness to it, there's a harshness to it, there's a rigidity to their stances where they're not in movement. You also see that there are kind of blocks in these neoclassical works of art where you have the three figures in the front, which is one group together, and then you have another group of women on the right, which is another group together, and you get these kind of groups and these groups of people. Here's another example, again, mythological subject matter and renewed interest in classical subject matter, and also a bit more restrained than what was being made in the beginning of the 18th century. Here is the last example of neoclassical art. At the very end of the 19th century, you start to see Egyptian and other more exotic subject matter being brought in. So you have a sort of sphinx-like figure up there on the left. Part of this was, of course, when Napoleon comes into power in the 1800s and begins to start taking over so many different countries. Very ineloquent historical analysis, but I'm sure you know what I mean. So this was done in 1808. As you can see on the rock, he has 1808 down there. So it was during Napoleon's time. And if you look at neoclassical furniture as well, you see a great influence of the Egyptian style. So around 1800 and in the beginning of the 1800s, there is a shift yet again to Romanticism. So like everything else, Romanticism was a reaction against the neoclassical. So you had emotion, you had movement, you had playfulness in the Baroque and the Rococo periods. You have this Stoicism in the neoclassical period. And again, you have Romanticism now reacting against that Stoicism. And it was a bit more emotional. The sublime is you often see in landscapes. There's just a bit more feeling to it. So here's a landscape where you can see this very bright light. You can see into the distance. Even though it's a landscape, there is the way that they use color really highlights and emphasizes the emotional impact of the landscape itself. You begin to start to see everyday subject matter or subject matter that was in the news being brought to light in some of these images. You also, as I said, with Napoleon's conquests, there's a greater interest in Eastern art as well. So you get to see examples of, they say, Orientalism influencing the Romantic period. Here, this was based on an actual news story of a shipwreck, and how they survived. So it's you see that emotion, you see the way the bodies interact with one another. They're exaggerated in how they reach towards one another. There's emotion there, which really wasn't apparent in neoclassical art. After realism, after romanticism, you go into realism. And again, so there's this constant movement between emotion and restraint in art, and within that, looking at the world around them and figuring out how to depict the world around them within the constraints of the style of the time. So in realism, it's really a French movement. It began in the 1840s and continued late into the 19th century, and it wanted to convey a very truthful and objective vision of contemporary life. So not this, which was really meant to affect how the viewer was analyzing this news event of this shipwreck. The viewer is meant to feel emotion. They're meant to feel sorrow for the men who have died, and to feel that anxiety of the men who still remain. But in realism, it's an objective and truthful vision of what's happening around them. And it emerged in the aftermath of the Revolution of 1848, which overturned the monarchy of Louis Philippe. And it was developed during the period of the Second Empire under Napoleon III. And French society, they were fighting for democratic reform, and the realists democratized art by depicting modern subjects drawn from the everyday lives of the working class. Prior to this, or during this whole period, there was a system in place in France as well as England called the Salon system, where once a year there was a big exhibit, and the public could go in and see art that was made in the past year. And the art was ranked. So historical paintings, like the ones that we saw, like this painting, for example, would have been the most highly prized work of art. And landscapes, portraiture, still lifes, other kind of art just was not believed to be as worthy. So the fact that these artists are now depicting everyday life was quite revolutionary, and they really rejected that idealized classicism that came to be during neoclassical art, and the exotic themes that we saw in Romanticism, and it's based on a very direct observation of the modern world. So here we have a country scene where you have real women from that time period depicted in their everyday life. Here you see a funeral, and it's very harsh in its depiction. It's a realistic portrayal of perhaps what a funeral would have looked like. And lastly, here's an image of women working in the fields. So it was really meant to be the everyday life of French people and elevating that to the status of a historical painting, which was very revolutionary and not very well received by the academics and the leading scholars and art historians of the time.